My text this morning is taken from Mark's Gospel, Mark 1:22. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. When I first read this, I thought the authority was in the way in which Jesus embraced life. Mark describes this gospel story. And in this gospel story, we hear about the healing of a man with the unclean spirit as having taken place in Capernaum. It is recorded also in Matthew and in other parts of the New Testament that Peter was married and possibly had children and lived in Capernaum. It is also quite possible that Jesus took up residence here for some time after leaving Nazareth. The New Testament evidence suggests there are two important aspects about this town. The first is that it's the centre of an industrial commercial fishing industry. And the second is that local residents were recruited and employed by the Romans as toll collectors. The money obtained in this way went to supporting the army of occupation, as well as the imperial governors and the administrators and the officials. These collectors were seen as collaborators because they were supporting and making possible the oppression of the Jews. Those who made their living from the fishing industry, on the other hand, were highly regarded for being in an honourable trade, whereas those who were toll collectors were considered quislings and pariahs. It's then quite fascinating to realise that in this social environment, Jesus makes no distinction between the two when he offers a call. It is in this setting that Mark describes a typical day in the life of Jesus. This is not to say that all these events took place on one day. However, they are illustrations of Jesus' authority and influence, and they are demonstrations of how he exercised this spiritual power. We read that on the Sabbath, Jesus goes to the synagogue, where he teaches with authority and also exorcises an unclean spirit. In the next week's lesson, we will learn that Jesus also heals Peter's mother-in-law and people who call at Peter's house. There is clear evidence throughout the Gospels that Jesus has a gift of healing, and today's reading is but one example of this. Not only was Jesus a healer, he also exhorted his disciples to heal and to offer healing in the name of God in return for hospitality. Today is the fourth Sunday in the period of Epiphany. The period of Epiphany allows us to examine and respond to the revelation of God as revealed in Jesus. During this period of time, we need to ask ourselves the question, what is it about the life, work, and mission of Jesus that reveals the nature and person of God? When Jesus reveals his healing power, is he in reality revealing the healing power of God available to all of us? Let us just briefly recap the story. A story which is reproduced in Luke 4:31-37. The account of this story in Mark is a standard account of how exorcisms, that is, the casting out of unclean spirits, take place. There's a standard pattern. Firstly, the demon recognises the exorcist and struggles against him or her. Secondly, the exorcist in a loud voice commands the demon to depart. The demon obeys, but of course makes a bit of a scene about it. The bystanders recognise the power of the exorcist. There are only 6 narratives in the Gospels that deal with people who have a demon or unclean spirit. And the Gospel of Mark uses the term demon or demoniac only in reference to the Syrophoenician woman and the naked man, you may remember, who lived in the tombs, Legion. Today we would probably recognise the man in the synagogue as having a mental illness with delusions of grandeur, as well as other delusions, rather than a person with an unclean spirit. Belief in demon possession was common in the New Testament, though the Greeks interpreted it differently to the Gospel writers. In Greek demonology, the demons were said to be the spirit of the dead, and they could be both good and bad spirits. They had the ability to be positive intermediaries that could even convey blessings. However, in the Gospels, the demons are always spirits with evil intent. The message then in this story is, if we manifest the sacred spiritual energy that we call God, it will keep the demons at bay. In this story, a person with unusual behaviours becomes the battleground for the war between good and evil spirits. We need to understand this metaphorically. Mark uses this story to demonstrate Jesus' power. How then do we today, with our knowledge of mental illness, respond to this gospel message? How can we communicate the power of Jesus to heal in a meaningful way? How can we convey this message with sensitivity and compassion? It is important when we examine this text today that we do not insinuate that an evil spirit possesses people with mental illness. Unclean spirits do not possess people with epilepsy. We know this from modern scientific information. We must be mindful that in our understanding of the gospel message, we do not erect barriers between people with mental illness and God, particularly when the thing they desire most is to feel the love, inclusion, and the support of a God presence. Many people who are mentally ill or who have epilepsy suffer the marginalisation of a fearful community. They do not need the exclusion of the church community as well. And yet, unfortunately, this does happen. Some years ago, when I was living in Adelaide, I was a chaplain for people with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities. And I was appointed by the South Australian Council of Churches, the first appointment of its kind, I believe, in Australia. In one circumstance, there was a situation where a parent rang me to say that their son with a disability was seeking to become included in a church community. I was asked by the mother of this teenage boy with significant disabilities to assist him to find a group of young people with whom he could enjoy social activities. As this was a Christian family, the mother approached the local church youth club only to find that they considered her son unsuitable because of his disabilities. This young man could not walk. He couldn't talk, but his mind was active and vibrant. He used a voice machine to communicate and was quite relaxed about having to rump walk across a floor when his wheelchair was not available. And as with all young teenagers, the hormones were rising, and he wanted to meet members of the opposite sex. In my first meeting with him, he communicated to me that he wanted me to pray with him. And after I completed my prayer, he was very eager to question why I had approached my prayer with the language I used, that I was raising to consciousness the needs of both of us. We had a fascinating and lively discussion through the use of his voice machine, which he was typing into the whole time that we were together. Hence, I became aware of his ability to communicate his thoughts clearly. All that was required was a little patience in waiting for a response. Attempts to encourage the youth club and the church to reconsider its decision unfortunately fell on deaf ears, even after we offered alternative strategies to their objections. The young man also was a very keen Australian rules football follower, and he was devoted to the West Adelaide Football Club, commonly known as the Bloods, a team of the South Australian National Football League. He asked his parents if he could join the cheer squad, and although they were apprehensive, they agreed to make inquiries. The reason they were concerned was that the Australian rules football cheer squads are not known for their social graces, religious adherence, or polite behaviour. But most importantly, his parents feared he may again be rejected. The response they received was quite overwhelming. The club officials welcomed them to the club and introduced the boy to the senior players, who took the time to wait for him to respond to them with his voice machine, and they responded to him with warmth, concern, and inclusion. The family attended a game, and an official introduced the boy to the leader of the cheer squad, who welcomed him warmly and then picked him up physically and carried him to a prominent place in the middle of the squad. The members of the squad then told his parents not to worry. We'll look after him until after the game. These young people quickly befriended him because they were not embarrassed in communicating with him through his voice machine. He was welcomed, befriended, and most important of all, he was included. So the question we could ask is, does the sacred energy we call God move outside of the church? Yes, of course we know that it does. Which group was the spirit of sacred energy moving in this situation? Jesus emphasises the healing power of embrace, as we witness in the story of the woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. Do you remember what happened? He reaches out after she touches the hem of his garments. He touches her, knowing that she is ritually unclean. And what happens here is that he calls her sister, a term of endearment. How important is the healing touch and the offer of inclusive friendship to people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people who have been marginalised and rejected by the community, but also to their friends and families? It's a frightening thing to think or feel that you are out of control of your thoughts and your behaviour, even out of control of your identity. To ask the question, do you know who I am? You probably know the story of our Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, going to an aged care facility. And he walked into a room where there were some people playing bingo, and he leant over and he took the hand of a young man, an older man, and said, "Do you know who I am?" And the old man looked at him kindly and said, "No, but if you ask one of the nurses, she'll tell you." I don't know whether you saw the rerun of the film Philadelphia just recently on television. Philadelphia is the story of a young lawyer played by Tom Hanks who contracts the AIDS virus through his homosexual activity. As a result of this infection, he is fired by his employer, and he launches an appeal and successfully defends his wrongful dismissal. What I found fascinating about this story is not that it's about a disease for which there is no cure, but about the illness for which healing is possible. The film provides an interesting battle between curing the disease and healing the illness. It also displays the importance of rejection and acceptance in the healing process. The stress of the firing of Hanks by his company reduces his immune system, but the support, acceptance of his lover, family and defence lawyers counteracts this distress. When Jesus reaches out to the woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years, we do not know if the touch actually stopped the flow of blood at that point. What we do know is that through Jesus' actions, the woman was brought back into community. And she welcomes this because she has experienced 12 years of exclusion and isolation. On the front of the order of service today, you have the story pictured of the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan. It's interesting about the Good Samaritan because when he reaches out to the man he finds beaten and lying on the road, he doesn't do so with side glances to see if God's watching. He does so because this man needs his help. And he reaches out with kindness. The crucial element in this morning's gospel story is that Jesus responds with compassion to those who have reached the limit of their endurance. Those people who society has marginalised and rejected. Jesus reaches out to embrace and offers respect and a sense of belonging. There is a wonderful Jewish term, tikkun, T-I-K-K-U-N, olam, O-L-A-M. It means to repair the world with kindness. I wish we had that as emblazoned on our church's beliefs. God's intent for our lives is to be nurtured and to offer nurture as we shelter in the care of each other. It is not our role to blame or ostracize. Jesus breaks through the barriers of social convention and purity codes and reaches out to the man who is in the depth of despair in this gospel story you heard this morning. And Jesus depends on us in the same way as he depended on his disciples to bring the message of hope to those who are rejected. The local faith community can play a vital role in bringing a healing community of nurture. And you in St. Michael's know that well, because so often you have been the soul of Melbourne when there has been a terrible tragedy. Remember, it only takes one person to reach out with love or to stand in solidarity to make a difference. To this we must confront our own fear. When we are faced with something we do not understand, fear is often the greatest barrier to healing, both for those who require healing and for those who offer the helping hand. Today, the call for us is to face our fears, to put our faith in the message of Jesus, not the message about Jesus, the message of Jesus, to gain our strength from his love and to reach out to all people, especially those who are vulnerable. This is our mission. I wish to make a number of statements, and you can actually respond by saying the word Amen. We are surrounded and filled with a sacred energy. Amen. We are not victims of our past. Amen. We can forgive ourselves and others. Amen. We have our own strength and abilities. Amen. We have something great to offer to our healing, the healing of our world. Amen. Amen, brothers and sisters. Amen. And so let it be. Let us now say together an affirmation of faith. We believe the call of God is an invitation to life. We can bear to hear it because it comes to us in grace and loving kindness. It is safe to hear it because Jesus stands with us as we listen and takes our hand as we move towards the suffering ones, the vulnerable ones, the ones whose voices we hear in God's call. We believe that the Spirit of God that we carry within will give us the gifts we need, even though we falter on the way and only now and then lift up the example of the life of Jesus. Amen.